Hello, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion as a part of the Tadaima, a community virtual pilgrimage. I am David Inoue. I'm the Executive Director for the Japanese American Citizens League. I'm joined for this panel by Floyd Mori, who is a former President and Executive Director for JACL, Shirley Higuchi, Chair of the Board of Directors for the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and Stan Shikuma, who is on the board of the Tule Lake Committee and also President of the Seattle chapter of JACL. Today, we're going to be discussing what can only be described as a long-time schism in our community surrounding the question of loyalty during the war. With JACL taking the position that we, as being labeled as essentially traitors to our country, had to prove our loyalty by doing whatever our country might ask of us, including willing compliance with the forced removal and incarceration of our families. On the other side, efforts to undermine the government's policies through any form of protest were labeled as disloyal, and not only were not supported by JACL, but actively opposed. So to start off our discussion, Floyd, I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit about some of the context of why did JACL follow this policy of promoting the idea of a loyal Japanese American? What were some of the external forces that were at play, and then also ultimately what was the result of that strategy?
Sure. We're talking about almost a century ago, 80 years ago or so. It's been a long time ago. So for a lot of us, it's hard to understand the mindset or what exactly was going on with the Japanese Americans at that time. I happened to be alive. I was a child at that time. My older two brothers actually went into the war, were soldiers. One of them was killed. So my family was engaged, and I was somewhat engaged in the culture of the day. And I think that's one thing we have to understand is the culture of the day. The Issei still ruled. There were a lot of new young leaders within the Nisei generation. But as we were challenged with many things during the 30s, discrimination, Nisei began to take a little bit more stronger role in community affairs. And as we know, JACL was organized in 1929, a few years before World War II. But I think the mentality, the culture was still much Japanese. Cooperate, let's not rock the boat. And I think a lot of us felt that, a lot of people felt that, we need to be model minorities, model people in order to progress. And so work hard, study hard is something that our parents taught us to do. So with that culture in mind, how do we approach this issue of being named as enemy aliens? And I recall being called names and being ostracized from the community to some degree as a little child. So this happened. The leader of JACL at that time, a young man, barely out of college, Mike Masaoka, raised in Utah, or where I'm from, was a strong academic. He was on the debate team at the University of Utah, and he had a strong voice. And he had some values that I think were within the values of a lot of other Nisei at that time, but he expressed them. And I think the majority feeling was, let's cooperate, let's not rock the boat, let's do what we can to prove that we are Americans and to prove that we are citizens. And I think this feeling sort of prevailed, and the idea of going against was something that just was not heard of within the community at that time.
Now, one of the probably what could be described as one of the successful aspects of that strategy was the formation of the 442nd. Do you want to talk a little bit about that regiment and what they accomplished? And
well, you know that Japanese Americans were not allowed to join the army at that time and be part of the army. We were declared as enemy aliens. And even those that were already in the army were really not allowed to participate. So I think it was a major accomplishment to convince those in power that, we are worthy citizens and we can defend. And as we know, the 442nd became the most decorated unit of its size in the history of U.S. military. We still have some surviving members of the 442nd, the Military Intelligence Service. My brother served in the Counterintelligence Agency, which is part of the MIS. And I think it was a very positive impact. They came back as heroes, not only within the community, but to many who really knew what went on in the war. And as I look back and some of the things we did with JACL, veterans of World War II were very key in a lot of things that JACL accomplished after the war. Redress. I remember first coming to Washington, D.C., and when we started talking about a Congressional Medal of Honor, were it not for the 442nd MIS 100 Battalion veterans that went around from door to door with our JACL staff talking about what they did, we wouldn't have got that gold medal. So, they have been heroes to the nation and to the community. And so it was basically a positive thing that happened.
Now, obviously, in order to form to begin to enlist Japanese Americans, we had to somehow get rid of that label of being the enemy. And what JACL, along with the government, did was, as we all know, administered what was the loyalty questionnaire, the questions 27 and 28. One asking about the willingness of an individual to serve, and then the other question about their allegiance, to pledge their allegiance to the United States and disavow any possible allegiance to a possible emperor of Japan that they may have never even known, having been born in the United States. Shirley, what was the response to the loyalty questionnaire at Heart Mountain?
Well, I think as you could understand, it was a very stressful and tumultuous time for the Japanese American community that were being confined. So I would say a combination of acceptance, resentment, and resignation, depending on who was responding to those questionnaires. Many of them answered yes, and it got them out in the clear, and they kind of moved on. But others thought the questions were somewhat confusing, or in some instances, like Takashi Hoshizaki, who's on my Heart Mountain board, he actually really thought through the analysis and realized that, why would I volunteer for a country when I'm behind barbed wire? So he essentially said that if you were to reinstate my land rights and my ability as a free man, I'd be willing to serve. But others thought the wording was very confusing as well, in terms of that they would say they would renounce their citizenship to Japan. I think many of them wondered that if they did do that while they were imprisoned by the US government, would they be left without a country? So it was really a poorly instituted process. I don't really know at the end of the day what it actually solved or proved, except I think maybe a couple of bad decisions that really affected many people. But it was a very difficult period, and it ended up being one of the most important historical aspects of Heart Mountain and our history with the foundation. But it's also, I know, have been a source of conflict within the Japanese American community in general.
And specifically at Heart Mountain, there was a group who in particularly resisted and the Fair Play Committee. Can you tell us a little bit about that group and what did they do to resist?
Well, Kiyoshi Okamoto was the leader of that group, the Fair Play Committee, and he was actually an older Nisei. But a lot of the individuals that really joined the Fair Play Committee at Heart Mountain were advocates early on in terms of organizing and protesting the conditions, sort of like a little bit of a protesting civil rights, grassroots development that already existed. So essentially they started meeting, informally, and in some of the research I did on Tako Shizaki, he had to bring $1 as membership dues, and they all started meeting. And I think that respect to the entire group of individuals that were interested in this, they very much began to realize that, what they were being asked to do and answer these questions behind barbed wire was very problematic.
Yeah, and ultimately, obviously, that was a segment of Heart Mountain. The far broader and more far-reaching impact of the loyalty questionnaire was really felt for those who were segregated as a result of that survey and sent to Tule Lake. Stan, can you share some of the extreme conditions under which the incarcerees at Tule Lake were placed under? Obviously incarceration was already a huge insult to Japanese Americans, but how did Tule Lake really take this to a different level?
Well, first off, I think we need to understand that the loyalty questionnaire, so-called loyalty questionnaire, was not really about loyalty. I think everyone today agrees, if they read the questions, that you cannot say that someone is loyal or disloyal based on 2 questions out of a multi-page questionnaire, especially when it's done a year after you've been put in a concentration camp, you've lost your job, you've lost your home, you've lost your chance at education, and possibly separated from family members. And then they ask you to answer these questions. So most of the people who answered no, or yes, but, or refused to fill it out at all, did so either because they were angry and frustrated or because they were afraid and confused by the questions. So all of those people, is about 10% of the population, 12,000, answered in some non-acceptable way to the government. And the government, it wasn't just saying no, no, it was yes, but, or no, yes, or yes, no, or I refuse to answer at all, could get you into Tule Lake. Tule Lake was a segregation center where they sent all of those people. And it there became the most crowded, largest and the most crowded of the camps, 18,700 people crammed into a space that was built for 15,000. So it's way overcrowded. It had one of the most authoritarian administrations. They increased security. The number of guard towers went from 6 before segregation to 28 after segregation. They also put guard towers around the farm, which previously had no guard towers at all. They erected a second fence. There was one barbed wire fence around the whole place. They erected a second one that was even taller. Eventually, they built a stockade, a jail within a jail, where they locked up people. And then they actually built a physical jail within the stockade area. So there was also many rumors of food being taken by people working for the administration and being sold on the black market. So there were shortages of sugar, there were shortages of milk for the children. Education was not being provided. Schools had shut down. So actually the only schools that were operating for a while were the Japanese language schools. So it was quite a mess within Tule Lake. And the administration swung from being overbearing, like they imposed martial law for nearly 2 months, in end of 43, beginning of 44. And they had 1,000 US Army troops stationed outside the gates that actually had tanks, literally had tanks, and a cavalry unit to patrol the perimeter. But they swung from this overbearing martial law period to then allowing groups like Hoshidan to have office space and did not interfere with some of their activities. So it was a very confusing and very troubled time within the camps. And it was just exacerbated by the WRA administration, as well as the army, the military that was camped right outside the gate.
In some ways, it almost became a self-fulfilling prophecy because of the policies that were placed, the trauma that was being inflicted upon the prisoners there.
Yeah, what's really important to look at it, that this whole thing was a government-imposed test to separate the community into kind of, they called it loyal and disloyal, but you can see it as being like the good Japanese Americans and the bad Japanese Americans. And that's, you see that a lot, like in the civil rights movement, there's the good civil rights folks who preach nonviolence and don't, cause too much damage. And then there are the bad civil rights folks who are more militant or boisterous, or actually, do some damage to the downtowns. And I think we need to look at why people are upset and why they answer things, rather than revert to this good and bad dichotomy, because that's a government-imposed dichotomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, Stan, you're actually kind of jumping ahead to some of the topics we're going to talk about a little later, but maybe Floyd, you can maybe talk a little about how maybe JACL did evolve in how it saw its role as a civil rights organization. Even I think during the war, there was a change early on. For example, JACL did not support like the Korematsu lawsuit against the government, but by the end of the war, was submitting amicus briefs, for example. But and obviously we've seen how JACL has evolved over the years as well. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I think JACL evolved somewhat like society evolved. During the war, it was a very patriotic ring to society. As we moved into the 50s and 60s, we began to recognize that there were imperfections within our society, and all was not hunky-dory. We needed to correct some things. And, we had the civil rights movement that began in the 50s into the 60s. The Civil Rights Act of the 60s. So, society was changing. And along with that, the Japanese American community changed from Nisei to Sansei, who started to go to college and become educated and understand a lot more about the whole picture, rather than a very narrow view of what this country was all about. And so we see signs of protest and resistance among Japanese Americans, and we see some leaders come forth that point out the wrong that happened during World War II, and then going one step further, those that began to recognize that there were wrong things done within our community during that period of time, and that there were some people who were stigmatized and ousted from the community because of what happened during World War II. And, we have people like Senator Dan Inoue saying that it was probably more courageous in those days for Japanese Americans to stand up for their individual and civil and human rights than it was for people to go out and serve in the army. So gradually recognition changed. And as we move into the 60s and 70s, 80s, we see even within JACL a lot more civil rights focus. And we got our Issei's the right to become citizens during the 50s, redress during the 60s and 70s. So things began to change. And up to the time in, what was it, the year 2000, when JACL finally recognized officially there was something wrong that happened during that period of time by the JACL, and actually passed a resolution to apologize and to actually hold a ceremony of apology for the resistors. So I think JACL, Japanese American Community, evolved with the time. And it was very positive for our community during that period of time.
Yeah, and obviously, you mentioned that there was a lot of stigmatization during the war, but as we all know, it actually continued beyond the war as well, well into the 50s, the 60s, and even to this day, there's still stigmatization that does go on amongst some people in our community. Shirley, how do you see the apology in 2000 with the ceremony in 2002? How did that help to lead to healing some of these wounds?
I think it was definitely a step in the right direction. I give a lot of credit to Floyd Mori during his tenure as the CEO of JACL to really move things forward during his tenure. But I think the one thing that we don't really understand completely is how complicated the history of the Japanese Americans and what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II really was. I mean, I think if we start back, initially, this was a plan by the government during a wartime crisis situation. And, you kind of wonder, what would you have done in that situation, whether you were answering those questions, or would you have actually volunteered? And I had this conversation with David Inoue, who did a film on the legacy of Heart Mountain, and we were walking through our museum, and he said, I would definitely volunteer, because he comes from a military background. His father was in the military. And I looked at myself and him and I said, I would have been a resistor. And part of me resisting, I think, was sort of thinking through really what was going on, like Tako Shizaki did. And what I had heard from him is that a lot of people assumed he was a coward, or he was just, disloyal and doing all these horrible things. But he actually did an intellectual analysis that I read in his WRA files, where he really felt that his rights were really necessary. But the problem is those stories about what the resistors did and what they were trying to do during that civil rights movement within the camps was something that wasn't really well publicized. It was very hidden. On one level, we had the government not talking about the incarceration itself. I never read about that when I was in high school or junior high school. It wasn't in my history books. And then on a second level, within the Japanese community, we're suppressing information. And growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and not being around a lot of other Japanese Americans, my source for knowledge, as I've mentioned to all of you, was the Pacific Citizen, because of the JACL newspaper that was delivered to our house on a regular basis, as well as Bill Hosokawa's book, Nisei the Quiet American, which was sort of the Bible at that time. I don't recall reading anything about the resistors in Bill Hosokawa's book. So I think when you don't really understand information growing up as a child into adulthood, even if it's been 75, 80 years, I think that what it does, it perpetuates misunderstanding, it perpetuates tensions. So I think education, and I think the work that JACL has done in terms of apologizing, which really means a lot in our community, and having Tule Lake speak out in terms of the concerns that they have in terms of how they can better heal. But it's not only Tule that needs to heal, it's not only Heart Mountain, it's not only Minidoka, it really, as a community, we need to heal. We were not the enemy of each other back in 42. We were the victims of a government policy that made it difficult for us to function. And I think that trauma still exists in our community today.
Now, going back a little bit to one of the things you said about what decision would we make if we were in that same position. I often talk about how I myself am a conscientious objector, and yet I've never been in that situation where I have to actually make that decision of will I serve or will I refuse to serve in the military. And not having actually had to make that decision, can I legitimately say I am who I believe I am? And the reality is that these decisions that people were making back then were incredibly difficult and under incredible levels of stress. And the pressure that they were under being in the situation, the places where they were, certainly made them so difficult.
But can I just make two quick points? So sure. The problem with the resistors and what happened to them was that they were not only being stigmatized by the government, the US government, their own country, but they were also being stigmatized by their own community. And that's why it was such a tough psychological position.
Yeah.
But in addition to Floyd's work with the JCL in terms of the apology, I just do want to say that Heart Mountain, and the one reason why I really am proud of the organization that I work with, is that they were one of the first individuals that really, and an organization that came out to really amplify what had happened with the resistors, through the work of Doug Nelson and Professor Eric Muller, who was our program advisor for the museum. So we always feel quite proud that we did have sort of grassroots movement as well to really tell the story and tell it openly and honestly.
Yeah, I might add that my deeper understanding of resistance came at a conference that these gentlemen participated in the University of Wyoming while I was the executive director of JACL. So knowledge began to come forth, a lot more understanding developed, and I think minds and hearts were changed as a result of it.
That's great.
Now, Stan, and when we're talking about how little people know about what happened, particularly with the resistors, and I think that's definitely true about with Tule Lake, and that's part of why I wanted you to talk a little bit about what was it really like there, because it was different from what all the other camps experienced. So obviously this past year, JCL passed a resolution of apology to Tule Lake. Why was that resolution so important in acknowledging what JCL did do and what its role was in essentially possibly creating Tule Lake as a separate place?
Yeah, so the experience with Tule Lake, even within the Tule Lake Committee, I've been active in that since 1979. We were not really aware or did not know much about the segregation center period of Tule Lake. And I think up until maybe 2000, very, very few people even knew that there was a segregation center, such a thing as a segregation center. Even today, a lot of people don't know exactly what that was, why it was set up and how it was operated and how it was made it different than all the other WRA and even the Department of Justice camps. It's undeniably the worst of the 10 WRA camps in terms of level of security, level of repression, misadministration by the WRA, and the stigmatization within and without. It was the only camp where you had people from all 9 of the other WRA camps combined together in one camp, plus some people from some of the Department of Justice camps, mixed in with 6,000 people who were yes, yes. They had answered yes, yes, but they refused to leave Tule Lake because they didn't want to have one more expulsion and movement. So you have all these different types of folks mixed together. Many of them had been the leaders of the resistance, the dissenters, the most outspoken dissenters in the camps they came from. And then you mix them all together. So there's, people who hadn't come from the same communities, that hadn't come from the same camps. They all had very strong opinions. And then you dump them together with some who were yes, yes, and a lot who were no, no. It just made for a very combustible and tense situation. After the war, there was a lot of stigmatization, like people who knew that you were from Tule Lake. Like Hiroshi Kashiwagi tells a story of he went back to San Francisco and he was walking down. It was a person who was his neighbor before the war, and he was ready to say hi, but the person saw him and crossed the street so they would not have to interact with him. I've heard stories from people who come to the Tule Lake pilgrimage saying that they lived in the Sacramento area, but as children growing up there, their father never took them to any Japanese American function. And they ended up living more in the Black community area of Sacramento. And we assume that's because he was purposely trying to avoid the Japanese American community. And for a child growing up in the Sacramento area to never encounter other Japanese Americans, you have to work pretty hard to do that. So that kind of trauma, ongoing trauma, really has impacted a huge portion of the community. And so we felt like we need to do something to try to resolve that, and bring down the tension and start some kind of dialogue, which is why we pushed for the resolution of apology. And for the most part, it was gratifying that a large majority of the chapters and the delegates were in support of it. But there is still some resistance and pushback from others. And we had a very long debate about the resolution. We eventually passed it, but there were a couple of amendments that were added that are problematic to Tule Lake resistors. One talking about violence in the camps, and another talking about pro-Japan elements in the camp. Because those are the two main issues that were thrown at Tule Lake folks as why they should be stigmatized, because they were violent and they were pro-Japan, and disloyal would be the third one. And, you know, by and large, those are false accusations, and or at least need to be looked at as to what are you talking about and why are you having that opinion? Because it's not a simple thing. Someone answering no to a question does not mean they're disloyal. So dissent and resistance is different than cooperation and compliance, but it's not the same as disloyal.
Yeah, and I think the challenge in all this, and when we talk about the euphemistic loyalty questionnaire, we talk about this resolution, it's very difficult to capture a lot of the detail and the nuance and everything that goes behind a lot of this in these limited words that words really cannot say enough to describe everything that is happening in this whole milieu of a community that's been torn apart, essentially. Now, obviously, this wasn't something that suddenly came about this past year, and this is all, as well as a lot of other things. This has been kind of an evolution. Floyd, you actually kind of made the first entreaties to the Tule Lake folks several years back. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that, and maybe some of what has happened since then that has led up to the point where we were able to do this resolution this past year?
Yeah, you know, as somebody in JACL and involved in the resistor discussion, the no-no discussion, certainly I'd heard a lot of people who had very bad opinion about JACL. When I went to, I did avail myself to go to a Tule Lake pilgrimage a number of years ago, and I think I was the first JACL staff person to ever go to a pilgrimage up there. When I went, you know, I actually ran into a girl that I dated in college from West LA, and I was wondering if she knew that I was going to be who I am, whether she would have dated me back in the college days. But anyway, my intent was to go up there and learn and to help Tule Lake people understand that JACL is certainly open and wanting to resolve the issues between us, and that we're all one community. And it was an interesting trip for me, because I was welcomed by many people, and many people were very happy to see that JACL finally came up to Tule Lake to see what was going on and what it was all about. On the other hand, there were still detractors there. There were some people who weren't too kind, but you know, that goes with the territory. And I think it began a process of, I hope, healing and a lot more openness and interaction between those that had been involved with Tule Lake one way or another, and JCL, and the whole civil rights movement in general. So that was my intent, to get us back together again as a community. And I see that we now do a lot of things in common with each other, and that animosity that was there is really diminished to basically non-existent these days. And, you know, I can understand those Nisei and Issei who were stigmatized during that period of time and had to live many decades being ousted by the community in general, not being welcomed. I can understand the bitterness. But you know, JACL has become a different kind of an organization, and I think there's a lot more positive action with the two organizations since that time. Stan may have some observations about, I think he was there when I was there. Was it you that threw that tomato at me?
I think, no. No, I remember, I think it was 2009 when Floyd came, and two reactions that stick in my mind is, as I think Floyd had mentioned to Barbara Takei, one of our leaders in the Tule Lake Committee, how that, yeah, some people are giving me the cold shoulder, and then one of the other board members kind of muttered under his or her breath, yeah, so like you got a cold shoulder for 4 days here. Just think about how people feel after 40 years of that. And that kind of testifies to the depth of the stigmatization and the trauma that caused. But on the other hand, I think the other thing I heard from other people at Tule Lake is, you know, some appreciation and respect for Floyd for showing up. You know, some people said, well, that takes a lot of guts to come here. But I think other people had more sense of appreciation that, and a glimmer of, so maybe this means that there can be some dialogue, that, you know, maybe that this is something that can break the ice between JCL and the resistor community. So I think things have progressed since then. We've had a couple of workshops at JCL conventions where we talk about the Tule Lake experience. We showed Resistance at Tule Lake, a fine film by Conrad Atterer when we were in Philadelphia, and which had a pretty good turnout and stimulated a lot of discussion. And I think that kind of combined to lead up to the resolution, which passed successfully. And then David, I know you came to the Tule Lake pilgrimage right after that. And,
I think I had a much easier time than Floyd did on my visit.
Yeah, and I think you were welcome. And I think that shows the evolution of things on both sides. That, you know, and Gary came with you, Gary Maeda, our president at the time. So that the president and the national director would come to a Tule Lake pilgrimage, and that they would be, you know, welcomed and appreciated for attending. I think shows that.
I think vice versa too, because you know, Barbara and Satsuka have participated in JCL conventions, and you know that I think has been very powerful and helped us along that path.
Yeah, I don't mean to say that everything is hunky dory. Because there are still very strong and some very hard feelings remaining, largely among those who actually lived through the experience. And I think that's another testimony to how deep the trauma is. And it's not just people that were at Tule Lake, it's also people who were at other camps who were maybe JCL or kids of JCL members. And what it really stresses to me is that everybody who went through that experience, they experienced trauma. And Satsuki Ina talks a lot about intergenerational trauma, how that carries on through generations. And I know it carries on in the Sansei generation, because I know I feel it, even though I was born after the war. And even Yonsei that we talk to, especially at the pilgrimages, will feel it in different levels, like the way that they can or cannot communicate with their parents and their grandparents. And a lot of that stems all the way back into the camps.
No, I think that, and when we talk about the trauma that was experienced, I think that sort of gives us an opportunity to talk about what do we see today where there are opportunities for us to work together more as a community. I think, Stan, you're obviously very involved with Sudo for Solidarity. Solidarity is a key word there. Can you talk a little bit about the work that Sudo is doing, and how does that stem from some of the need that we as a community need to heal, but also that we see that other communities need to heal as well and have hope?
Yeah, so Tsuda for Solidarity is a national network of Japanese American activists who are centered and focused around immigration issues. And we're, along with actually some chapters of JACL, we're among people who stood up for Muslims right after 9/11. When the Muslim ban came down, a lot of us rushed out to the airports to show support. But the thing that really kicked it off was when the zero tolerance policy was promulgated in 2018, and children were actively being separated at the border from their parents and their families. And that really set off a reaction within a lot of Japanese Americans, because the whole idea of imprisoning children, separating families, mass incarceration into what essentially are concentration camps, that all struck a chord with our community, because that's what we went through during World War II. And so it was a natural thing to step forward and say, no, this, at the point of redress, we were saying, never again will we allow this kind of atrocity to happen. And it's happening in our country again. So we feel obligated to step forward and say, no, this has to stop. And it's expanded even more now with the Black Lives Matter uprisings to, we've expanded our focus to say that, yes, we need to support our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters, as well as our immigrant brothers and sisters, because we're all here in the US, we're all humans, and everybody deserves the basic respect that we all want our kids to have and live with.
Yeah. Stan mentioned 9/11. Floyd, you were actually JCL national president when 9/11 happened. That was pretty impactful upon JCL, and really, I think, kind of re-energized the organization, didn't it?
Yes, I recall it very well. I had just returned from Japan the night before and was on my way to a community activity when stuff started to come over the airwaves about that. So I immediately got on the phone with John Tataishi, who was our national director at that time. And we decided that we needed to make a very strong statement that, because we suspected that Muslims are going to be stigmatized as Japanese Americans were when the attack happened on Pearl Harbor. So we put out a very strong statement the very next day, supporting the idea that, yes, it was a bad occurrence, but remember that most Muslims are loyal citizens of this country, and let's not let happen to them as what happened to us. And what was good a few weeks later is to have President George Bush say that basically the same thing. Don't let happen to Norm, or to Muslims today, is what happened to Norm in World War II. So 9/11 was a very important part of JSL working with other organizations. When Katrina happened, there are many Vietnamese along the Gulf Coast, and they had no voice. They had no organization at that time. And so we stepped in very strongly to help be their voice and to provide for their needs along the Gulf Coast. And that led to another incident in Atlanta, Georgia, where the Vietnamese community was being imposed upon. And we were able to get Mike Honda, who was a congressman at that time, along with the Vietnamese congressman, down to Atlanta to meet with the community and to alleviate the pending problem that was going to happen there. So I think there are many instances where, Japanese experience during World War II is an example of what not to do when things happen today. And, Stan has enumerated many of them. And I think we are stronger by the fact that we are able to work with other organizations, and they, again, can support us in the issues that we continue to have. But 9/11 was a very important turning point. One other program in the JACL was the bridge building program between Muslim youth and Japanese Americans, where I think a couple of the areas still have these bridge building programs where Muslim youth are brought in and educated on the Japanese American experience, and in hopes that they will not allow to happen to them what happened to us. So there have been a lot of opportunities for us to work with other people since that time. Another organization we've worked very closely with is the Turkic American Alliance. They are Muslims, and they have had some issues and problems with the current administration. So, there are areas where we can work where our problems were very similar.
Yeah, I think it really makes us wonder if more people had stood up for us during World War II, could things have turned out differently? When there really nobody did stand up for Japanese Americans, which really did put us in the place where we were. Where it's hard to resist when you don't have anyone else resisting with you. We've been talking a little bit about divisions in the community as well. So Shirley, you've been very involved with the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, and that's a group that has really brought together elements of our Japanese American community to work together. Can you talk a little bit about that group?
Well, essentially, the group, what historically was meant to bring as many stakeholders together in the community, all the various camps, other memorial sites and museums, to have sort of a unified way to not only advocate for Japanese American confinement sites funding grants, but other initiatives that we may all have a common goal with. It wasn't really an easy start, and Floyd was also involved in this. This carried over from a lot of his work in JCL, but it's sort of the concept of bringing people together and having more of a unified ability to advocate as a community, as opposed to splintering off and having all these divides, which we've had historically in the last 75 to 80 years because of our history. So even though it seems sort of like a common sense approach to how to bring folks together to be better advocates for our needs in our community, it was very difficult because of just what we talked about for the last hour, in terms of the histories between different organizations. But I think we're at the point of sort of getting past that at this point, and we're looking for unified ways to help all the sites and all the stakeholders. Floyd is actually leading some of the advocacy along with JCL, David, yourself, around extending the JACL program and focusing on an education bill that will help promote the Japanese American community and to find additional funding to preserve our sites. So I think we're really getting there, but I also think as a community, we need to cut ourselves a lot of slack, because again, we were victims of the situation, and when folks are victimized and they become splintered, it takes a lot of time for you to heal. And I think that Sewer for Solidarity has been a really nice way to come in to allow the Japanese Americans and the younger generation to have a voice, but to also have a purpose in terms of helping other communities. So in some ways it sort of justifies, I guess my father once said, you know, I feel like I've made it in my life already, and I don't know what to do with my Japanese American history and incarceration, but to try to figure out ways to help others. And that relief of being able to help others, I think, is part of what heals us. So I hope we could continue to do that as a unified group.
And when you mentioned the importance of education, I think that so much of what all of us do when we talk about the Japanese American experience, it is trying to educate people about what our experience is, but how does it apply to what else is going on? And Floyd had talked extensively about with the Muslim situation. And right now we have issues of division throughout our country. What lessons do you think that we as the Japanese American community can bring to this country around some of the division that's happening, whether it is around, whether it's Black Lives Matters versus Blue Lives Matters, or just reparations for the African American community, affirmative action. These are all very divisive issues that oftentimes, even as our own Japanese American or even Asian American communities, oftentimes we're even divided around these issues.
Floyd, do you want to take that? Yeah.
I'll just say one thing that, yeah, I think just more interaction with other organizations and communities are very essential. One thing that has happened here in Utah with the Black Lives Matter, as an example, is the Japanese American youth, JACL youth here in Utah, developed a program to have a seminar workshop with Black Lives Matter, so we could understand where they're coming from, what they've done, and let them know some of our concerns also. So it was a very excellent exchange, something that our young people were hungering for, and will help them to be better citizens and better JACL members. So reaching out to others, I think, is very critical.
I think that, and again, I think I mentioned this, I've been participating in the Sewer for Solidarity healing circles, and I agree with Floyd that participation, and he's been really great at that, Floyd, and you've been good at that, and I think it's really important. But I also think that we need to do still some more healing and repair in our own community. And participating in the healing circles and working with my groups, I really find it's really funny how a lot of the sansei have had all the similar experiences as other sansei, yet we still can't sort of reconcile like why our parents or our grandparents acted a certain way or had certain ideals or certain habits. So, and there's still a lot of tears and a lot of upset, I think. So I think in addition to being able to reach out to partners, I still think we need to continue to heal, because it's hard to help others when you feel not completely whole yourself. And I think that's the kind of work that we need to continue to do, hopefully through JACS, hopefully through Suru, but for us to come to some form of reconciliation that even makes us stronger. And I hope that doesn't sound too hokey, but I really feel very strongly about that on something that I picked up. Stan, I don't know if you have any response to what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would like to echo something that David mentioned about we want to be the friends that we did not have in World War II, because I do believe that it could make a big difference. Another thing that we say often in Suru is that we have the moral authority because of our experience as a community with child imprisonment, separation of families, mass incarceration, denial of civil rights. We have the moral authority to speak on these issues, whether it's around immigration, racial profiling, Black Lives Matter, some of the discrimination that people face. But with moral authority comes a moral responsibility, that if you have that kind of moral authority to speak on an issue, you have a responsibility to go ahead and speak out. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is look to the people who are suffering, who are the victims of, or the targets of these things. And today that includes a lot of Asians because of the whole Chinese virus thing, but also the Black Lives Matter uprising and historically indigenous folks, the Native Americans. And I think we look towards them to see what it is they're saying and really take it to heart, what kind of suffering and discrimination they're experiencing and what do they need, how can we help, and take a lead from them rather than kind of going in on our own with our own idea of what we think is needed. We should look to the people who are actually suffering the consequences and then follow that lead and support that.
Stan, I wanted to actually go back to earlier you had talked about sort of the dangers of the sort of the good immigrant, the good civil rights warrior versus the bad one. And I think that that's also the lesson that we have from this whole story of what happened with JACL versus the resistors, that oftentimes those in power will try and divide us and separate against one another. And what we really need to do is find that solidarity to work together and not let them split us up into the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, or an affirmative action, for example, splitting us up into
Sure.
those who deserve or don't deserve.
Sure, and that's the whole point of like the model minority myth, is that the powers that be will set up, well, these are the good minorities because they shut up and they, don't complain when they face discrimination, basically, versus the bad minorities who speak up and complain and go out in the street and protest. And we need to get away from that because it's a tactic of division to divide people, whether it's along religious lines or racial lines or class lines. We need to see beyond that to everyone's humanity. And do we really believe that all people are created equal? Do we really believe in equality and justice for all? Because if we do, then we have to get beyond that, see beyond the separation of there's a good group and there's a bad group. Or, yeah.
And it's oh, I was just going to comment. I just, growing up, I always heard the term troublemaker. And I didn't really I never understood what troublemaker really meant until I accidentally used the word in front of a resistor. And you should have seen the expression on his face because it was just a common word, that my mother would use as, oh, our next door neighbor, they're troublemakers. And I'm like, I mean, they weren't Japanese Americans. They were, just other neighbors, but it was a term that she used to really identify people that were troublemakers. But that's almost a derogatory term in the Japanese American community, I think.
Of course, we all know now that it's good to get in a little bit of good trouble.
Yeah.
We are at about an hour now, so does anybody have anything else they'd like to add before we close out? I feel like we could keep going, but we were only supposed to be about 45 minutes, and we've already blown past that timeline.
Well, I failed to mention the resistors at Heart Mountain that ended up going to trial in the largest trial in Wyoming, and were found guilty by a very racist judge. And when we interviewed Tako Shizaki and some of the other resistors, they felt they were going into one prison to another. And so in some respects, being in prison at McNeil Island wasn't that bad. But I think the shame of having to go to prison and being found guilty for the wrong reasons was very difficult for the resistors. So.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate all of you joining this conversation today. I think the one thing that is clear is that there's still a lot of pain. There's a lot of healing that needs to continue to happen. And this conversation is just a part of that ongoing process. And this is something I don't think you really can really heal. The scars are always going to be there, and we're always going to have to address that. But I think we do, that's the important thing, that we do address it. we continue to have these discussions and try and evolve as a community, and for JCL, evolve as an organization. So thank you very much, the three of you, for joining me today, and we'll talk again sometime.
All right, thanks for having us.
Thank you, David. And thank you for all that you've done to try to raise issues and pull people together.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Thank you.